Hi, good morning, Charlie. How are you?
Really good guy. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm doing well, thank you. I'm doing well. It's a good start to the day. We have a range of Gusbourne's wines to go through, and we're sat here. You're going to lead us on a wonderful tasting, I have no doubt. Can you fill anybody in, or fill us all in rather, on Gusbourne's history and yourself, and then we'll get down to tasting some wines?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gusbourne's quite a historic estate. We date back to the earliest mention was 1410, and we're based in the sleepy village of Appledore, which is in the sort of southeast corner of Kent, pretty much as far southeast as you can get before you're in the sea and over the channel. The estate's very historic. The original owner was a guy called John de Gusbourne, which is where the name comes from. And I think our understanding of it really is Gus meaning goose, and Bourne is a sort of dried riverbed. So it's kind of an old estate dating back to a long time. And where we're based, I guess, in the Garden of England, very well known around here for producing the best fruit in the country and orchards. And we have some amazing vineyard sites here. In terms of grape growing and winemaking, that's a much more recent thing. In 2004, the estate was bought by a gentleman called Andrew Weber, who was our founder, who was a South African knee surgeon, and his daughter was actually living close to the estate, and he saw these beautiful south-facing slopes. Low altitude, close to the sea. And he grew up in Stellenbosch, so he was surrounded by vine, wine. And he thought, wow, okay, this place looks great. And I guess this was on the back of the first pioneering wave of people planting vines in England and focusing on the classic sparkling wine. So he decided to plant the first vines here back in 2004. And of course, back in those days, English wine was still very much an untested success, and all of his family thought he was absolutely barking mad, and what are they doing with it, his money? But actually, he was quite visionary in those days of taking that leap, and I guess the rest is kind of history. In terms of we released our first wine in 2010, and that was released to fairly warm welcome from all the critics, and since then we've gone to sort of grow and grow, both in size and I think in terms of quality over the years. Personally, I came to Gusbourne in 2013, so nearly 8 years ago. Before that, we were having the wines made elsewhere, and in 2013 we bought everything in house. So I came over and we built the winery and started to really delve into what we've got here as an estate. And since that time, when we first had planted the vines in 2004, there was about 20 hectares. We now have about 93 hectares, so a decent size.
Yeah.
And I guess the underlying principle of our ethos and principles is we always set out just to try and create wines that can really challenge some of the best wines from around the world. And that's our underlying ethos and principle that keeps driving us forward, I guess.
Okay. Great. I think that's the perfect way to go on to some wines. Where would you like to start?
Well, I thought we'd start with our Brut Reserve.
Sure.
We've got actually four wines today, sorry. A really interesting tasting, all from the 2016 vintage.
Okay.
So I think this is a really good way of, firstly, it's an exceptional vintage anyway, but it's also a really good way of looking at each of the different styles and the blends we do in some detail. So the first one we've got is our Brut Reserve, and I guess this is our take on a classic cuvee. So classic blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier, and that blend will depend on each year, any given year. But what we're looking for in this wine, I guess, is of all the wines we make, it's probably got the most generosity and roundness and fullness. And that's something that we're, I guess, reasonably known for in terms of English wines. I guess on the whole spectrum of where we sit, I was probably on the riper, fuller spectrum of what's out there. And I think this is a really good embodiment of that.
Okay. And so, as you say, this is if somebody's being introduced to Gusbourne, you think this is the best place to start?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, entry level is always a difficult term, especially when they're reasonably priced wines, and I think of exceptional quality. But this is one of the wines I think that really sort of is consistently, very, very solid. And again, it's just a nice. If people have this preconception about English wines being, perhaps a bit austere and a bit high acid, this is a really good introduction to say, wow, okay, this is really full and round and rich. So it's a good one to test on people who don't know much about English wine.
Okay, great. Let's go through it.
So it's already starting to pick up. 2016, but it spent about 3 years on the lees, probably about 6 months on the cork, and all of a sudden it's starting to really open up now. It's starting to shed some of its primary fruit. Yeah. It's got this lovely sort of stone fruit, and I always find with our Brut Reserve, there's a lot of orchard fruit in there, which is not necessarily usual for this blend because there's a high proportion of the Pinots and the red groups, and you'd associate that more with red fruit. But I always find this blend seems to really deliver on the apple sort of pear spectrum. And but it's then starting now to really develop those lovely tertiary bready patisserie notes, and so apple pie and baked apple and those sort of characteristics.
I immediately got the citrus, which again is quite a classic English sparkling wine, but very much the green apple, as you said. It's got a lovely edge to it, a really well defined citrus style. And then there's a good mouthfeel. It's definitely got a nice body to it. It's a bit of fullness, which you want because you don't want the wine to disappear too much. Nice finish. It's a very well-balanced wine, and I think that's quite difficult for English wines to achieve because of our cooler climate, and there's a lot of variables. As we all know, the summers can't be great. I mean, it's pot luck most of the time, which obviously have a big impact on your grapes and the eventual harvest. So, yeah, the main thing I picked up was balance, which is great because, as mentioned, it's not that easy to achieve.
It's got so the vintage was very interesting. I should probably set the scene in terms of 2016, which is perhaps one of my favourite vintages. And the reason being is generally you get two types of harvest. You either get a hot harvest, which is lower in acidity and round and full, or you get a cooler harvest, which is more, I guess, lean and elegant and poised in its profile. And usually you can look at wines and think, okay, that wine was a bit like X, Y, and Z in the past, or like another type of wine. And 2016 comes along and you think, wow, it's completely different to anything else I've had before. Okay. And one of the defining characteristics, I think, of the vintage is it had both high acid, but then also very high sugars and very high levels of ripeness. So what that means is you get this lovely, ripe, round fullness to the wine, but after that sort of dissipates, you get this lovely sort of laser beam, as you say, of lemon and citric acid that sort of helps to just carry the length going forward. So it's quite a unique wine, and I think it'll one that will age exceptionally well.
I was just about to comment on that, thinking about how ripe the citrus elements are. I can imagine, a little bit of aging, it'll slightly calm down, and it will have a wonderful balancing, rounded texture to the wine. So I'd really like to try this with some food. I think it'd be great with slightly richer pastry dishes, something that's got quite a bit of depth to it because it's got a lovely, firm, crisp acidity, and I think that would cut through certain foods really well. And then, as you say, as the wine develops, as it ages and matures, there'll be a little bit more balancing out with it. But it's a really great way to start the tasting. I feel like I'm alive.
No, I think all these wines, especially, I think you're right, and it's got that lovely. It's great with things like lots of Asian food in terms of both, almost sushi and having to cut through that fattiness of the food, but also for some slightly spicier. I think the Pinot elements really handle a bit more of the sort of Oriental spice characteristics as well. So it's quite a versatile wine.
And so you have tried it through a meal then?
Oh yeah, extensively most days. Yeah, I mean, I kind of find with the Chardonnay driven ones there, not limited choices, but they're so well suited to the obvious things. And the more you put Pinot in there, the more you can really sort of stretch it out throughout the meal and try with lots of interesting that you wouldn't think of matches.
So what is it that you think the Pinot is adding?
In terms of food matching?
Or just to the wine itself?
Well, in general, I mean, it does depend on the year, but in general terms, Chardonnay provides the backbone, the structure. So it has this lovely acid line that goes front to back, and is really consistent and ages supremely well. And that really is what you built your frame of your wine upon, the Chardonnay. And then if that's the skeleton, where you're getting the flesh and the weight and the texture and all that stuff, that all really comes from the Pinots, in particular Pinot Noir. And Pinot Meunier is an interesting one for us. I know in other parts of the world, it can be a real fruit bomb. We never generally find it so much in England because we're a cooler climate. Yeah. But I find it has a lovely tertiary character. So this really sort of, leafy sous-bois, as they say in France, this sort of really interesting, woody, earthy character to the wine, which is really appealing for adding that complexity.
I was just about to say, I think it's very important to add not just the complexity, but the depth to the wine, because wine does need more than just the initial burst of intensity from crisp, fresh citrus fruits. It does need the extra complexity. Great way to start the tasting, Charlie. Excellent.
It's a very good one. Happy with that.
Absolutely. Do you want to move on to the next one?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. So I think we'll try the next one is our Blanc de Blanc.
Blanc de Blanc.
2016 again. And quite a different wine. And I guess if the first wine is really our, cellar wine, if you like, it's kind of it's perhaps more reflective of the winemaking. Our Blanc de Blanc, on the other hand, is very much the vineyard wine. So this is the wine that I think really reflects the soils and where we're from. It's classic in its sort of Chardonnay, so it's got that lovely lemony sort of citrus poise. But I guess the key thing we're looking for in this wine is minerality, and we have to look for that really interesting experience of where it's from. That sort of has a sense of provenance, sense of place, and that's really important when we come to doing all the blending components that we're currently underway doing at the moment and doing today. I guess one thing to point out with this is, I should explain that a little bit because it's a key part of our philosophy of how we go about making the wine. We only use the fruit that we grow. So we have these 93 hectares on 2 different sites, and there's an importance of only using the fruit you grow. Obviously, from a more basic level, that you're just in complete control from start to finish of the quality. So you're going to get the best grapes you possibly can because you're in control. But more importantly for us is this: it gives you the opportunity to really delve into the soils and the sites you've got to try to work out what your true expression is and how these soils and these vineyards express themselves through wine. And that's really important. So because of that, we have all these different vineyards, and we have 15 different vineyards, but within these different blocks of different types of clones or varieties, and they all have different characteristics and different flavors. And we'll pick everything separately, we'll press everything separately, we'll ferment everything separately. Okay. And at the end of this process, you will have at the moment we've got about 100 tanks and maybe 200 barrels. And that gives you a really nice palette to blend with, to play with. And what we've been doing, we then spend a lot of time sort of tasting through these wines. And we go at every single component, we taste it separately, we grade it, we assess it, and work out where it sort of fits, which we do at the very beginning of the year. And then we start to put these wines together again. And the wines that really demonstrate this lovely minerality of sort of oyster shell, of sort of almost saline, almost a bit salty, we push towards our Blanc de Blanc. So in some ways, it's probably the most true expression of all the wines we make.
Does that mean with the Blanc de Blanc, you're looking for a sparkling wine with a bit more of a defined edge? Is that the intention? Like, is this the clarity in the wine?
That's right. Purity, clarity, drive, energy. They're words to describe this. Whereas the first one is about roundness, fullness, texture. This is more about drive and energy and focus. And I think Chardonnay naturally does that. It's a more acidic variety. And so, it's the one wine I think in this country we make that is really so interesting. And it's all about the acidity. And acidity can sometimes be a bit of a dirty word, when you think of things being a bit sour. But actually, acidity is key to what we're doing in England. It's what makes our wines vibrant, exciting, and different from everywhere else. So what we've got to try and do as a country is really embrace that acidity and make sure it's vibrant and refreshing as opposed to a bit too sour. And finding that knife edge of what we do is what we're trying to achieve with this wine.
Which goes back to most things. It is about the balance. But as you say, it's nice to have a wine that is intentionally has the crispness. I was thinking of it as a real defining edge to a wine, and that's a wonderful thing to have because you do want it to cut through certain elements. And it's also good to have definition. That's what I'm looking for. It's nice to have a wine that has a lot of definition, a lot of clarity, purity. The main thing I noticed was just how much it zinged down the side of the tongue when in there, which was lovely, quite surprising. But beautiful. And I think this wine will improve with a bit of age as well because it's quite punchy in a really good way. But it's again another one that I'd like to try with some food.
Yeah, and this one's had a bit of extra time. We've only just released this really, so it's had a bit of extra time on lees.
Okay.
So on the sun, and that's really important for giving that. You need to balance that acidity and the freshness with a bit of weight and softness. So we leave that for about 4 years on the lees. And that seems to really sort of balance acidity and give you the weight and the structure. Okay,
so 4 years, that's a good bit of aging then on the lees. That, as you say, that will be adding a lot of the texture and a lot of dimension to the wine. Okay.
And we also, the other thing we do a bit, we use probably, we use a little bit of oak. And oak's a really useful way of also giving you that bit of extra ripeness and fullness and roundness. So this wine might have about 10% oak. Of that, only about 2 or 3% is new. So it's actually, we only want that to be a very subtle thing in the background. So really, we want that to be almost like salt and pepper, I guess, is a little bit of seasoning. And it gives you that little touch of toast and spice. And then we use about 7 or 8% of old oak. And the old oak's not really about delivering any flavour as such. It's about delivering this roundness. Older oak. So we use a bit of old oak judiciously in certain years to sort of bring that, again, that balance to the wine.
So the older oak, are they imported barrels or ones you've had for a while?
The oak, we've now got to a system where we pretty much have a renewal program for our oak. So each year we'll get rid of some barrels and then we'll introduce some new barrels. And that way it keeps the percentages about right. And of course we make a bit of still wine as well. So that kind of works with that. The general rule of thumb is that unless the barrels start tasting off or they start leaking, we keep them. They're really valuable.
Of course.
And they're a useful component for adding all this weight.
How is there any way of knowing whether it does leaking, not just the liquid, but also perhaps it's becoming too porous, like the wines are being interfered too much with oxygen? Is that something you can manage?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a certain amount of maintenance of making sure you're looking after the barrels properly and assessing them. And some of them they do taste a bit sherry-like at times, and so that's generally the time where you think, okay, let's kind of park those, get rid of those. Interestingly enough, but even if that's one barrel and if it's in a blend, very small percentages, it's something you taste on its own and think, oh wow, that's going down the oxidative path. Actually, it's a very tiny component. It's really useful. And again, it adds to this complexity. And when it's a bit like perfume, or tea blending, is that all these different parts and then you put them all together. And it has a synergy, I guess, between everything in there that's quite exciting.
That's exactly what winemaking is, which starts from the moment you plant the vine. There is so much going on there, so many elements that come into it, which are down to the climate, the terroir, and then, as you say, you bring the grapes into the winery, and that's when you get to have all the fun, mixing the oak and everything else. So there's a lot going on there.
There's a lot going on. And I think if you're trying to copy someone else, you wouldn't be able to. It would end up with a completely different product because of all the variables along the way. So that's quite reassuring in a way that you are making a wine that is the way it is just because of what you're doing. There's almost an unconscious pathway to where you're getting to at times. It makes you unique.
And as you say, that's the point. You want to have your stamp on the wines. But, if somebody's having a Gusbourne wine, that they need to know, okay, that's what Gusbourne represents. That's the wines that I'm having, which is why people go back for more.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I should probably sort of mention as well, just on that, and going back to the year, and interestingly, we're tasting all vintage wines here, just to highlight that we actually only make vintage wines, and that's a key part of our philosophy. And it's not really demonstrated in this lineup actually because they're from all the same year, but we feel that the vintage is actually a really important part of the story. And winemaking is all about stories, right? It's kind of, it's not just liquid in a bottle. It's about who made it, where it was made, what were the conditions, what makes that wine unique to sort of give that real experience. So for our point of view, the year is key to that. So the vintage is really important to give you that sense of what's different. And I remember this, years ago, speaking to people and, you're presenting a non-vintage wine and they say, well, what's new? What's new? And you're like, well, it's not new. But it's the same. And that's great. And you're sort of thinking, can we do better than that? Can we actually try and do the best we can in any given year? That's what we're trying to do. Obviously, that comes with the challenge of inconsistencies between different vintage, and how can you get this consistency in the product if you're doing it in different years. And for us, I think the biggest insight I had was in 2012, which in English wine terms was a bit of a write-off, and some people didn't make any wine at all, and it was annus horribilis for the English wine trade. But actually, we made a wine, a Blanc de Blanc that year, which was voted in Decanter as one of the top wines for that year. So it kind of gave me the confidence to think, okay, if that's the worst we can ever do, then that's really reassuring. And we have this view, I guess, that it's not necessarily about better or worse, it's just different expressions. And we can do to mitigate that through the blending and through some of our winemaking techniques to try and even that out. But it's really important to try and show that off if you can.
Speaking of focusing on different vintages, are you keeping wines as a little reserve from each vintage so that at some point in the future you could do a vertical tasting?
Yes, we keep a little bit of reserve wine, and again, but our concept of reserve wine is very different from other people in terms of that consistency. For ours, it's just giving you an extra little bit of a blending component. So, for instance, 2020 wines we're blending at the moment, full, rich, round vintage. Actually, sometimes you need a bit of direction and a bit of the hole in the wine. There's a little bit that needs filling out. And some of our reserve wines will have a small amount from other cooler years, like 19 or 15. You can add a tiny bit to that. It has a really big impact in the wine. So it's about just trying to make that wine as interesting and complex as possible without detracting that it's all about that year and it's about that year. So we do have reserve wines and in lots of different formats, and some are in smaller oaks, some in larger oak formats, some in tank. And it's really just having tools at your disposal to try and make the best wines. And we do regularly taste them, as you say, against each other and see how they evolve, see how they taste. But actually, probably the more interesting comparison is every year, at the beginning of the year, we get everything out of the cellar that we've got. We disgorge them, and then we try them all next to each other. So we'll have 10 vintages of Blanc de Blanc, 10 vintages of Brut Reserve.
Right.
And you can just map it through. And we usually do this before we start the blending process as a way of calibrating and saying, okay, this is the style. And all these keywords I used, the Brut is accessible, round, full, the Blanc, driven, focused, energetic. And we try to really sort of get that instilled in our head so that when we start to taste all the base wines, we know what we're looking for. So it's an important part to try and, especially if you're doing vintage wine, just make sure that you're fully calibrated into what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and it's your style. That's a very interesting way that you've explain that, because you're being very precise. As you say, particularly if you're going through the previous vintages to understand exactly where those wines were at the time, where they are now as you're trying them, but then also where you as the winemaker, you're positioning yourself for the future wines, or for the wines that you're making then and there, to go, where does this fit within our collection? I also imagine that's quite a bit of fun.
Really, really good fun. It's a big day, and we try to involve all of the winemaking team, but also all of the sales and marketing guys. So everyone gets real ownership and understanding of what we've got coming up. And, you know, an honest thing, what did we not like so much about that wine? Is there a way we can tweak that and improve that? What do we really like about this wine? Why? What's the chemical reason in the vineyard or the winery? Okay, how do we reduce that? How do we increase that? So there's an intellectual process, I guess, of tasting these wines and seeing where they are. But you're absolutely right as well, is that, you know, the problem with blending is you're looking at a wine and you're saying, okay, I'm putting this together now, but what's it like in 4 years' time? How's it evolved and grown? And having the ability to look backwards and say, well, okay, well, the 2020 is a bit like 18, and probably a bit like 14, and probably a bit like 11. So how have those wines developed? How have they aged, and what's worked and what hasn't worked? And that allows you a bit of foresight in terms of how this wine might end up in the future.
I think that's the perfect way to move on to the next one, Charlie.
Yes. Okay, so the next one we have is our Blanc de Noirs. And I guess actually this wine is the polar opposite of the Blanc de Blanc. So if you have a yin and a yang, this is where these wines sit. So when I talked about the key words for Blanc de Blanc, and you talk about energy, drive, precision, focus, the opposite for that for me is from the Blanc de Noir, made from the red grapes, 100% Pinot Noir in this instance. And what we're looking for, something is a bit darker, as the name and the bottle would suggest. So perhaps it's a bit more brooding, deeper in this sort of style. It has more of those red fruits, but it almost moves into the blueberry, blue fruit spectrum, almost a bit of violets in there. And it has a bit of a dark undertone, a drag to it, which I think is really interesting. Almost a touch of sort of sandalwood, a perfume, sort of deeper tone to it as well. And that makes, yeah, and it makes the perfect foil for the Blanc. It does really well, and this is a style that we can't do in England, I don't think. Well, personally, in our place, every year, Chardonnay and Blanc de Blanc is something that's easy to achieve. To get that deepness and fullness in the wine, it's more easy to do in riper years. So this is something we won't necessarily do every year. But in years like 16, where it really suits it, we will do.
Definitely fuller, as you're saying. There's more going on there. Really, really pleasing finish, actually. Almost a slightly drying sensation on the tongue, which is nice. But yeah, it's the fullness. That's what I'm picking up on this one compared to the other ones, which is a great way to taste wines like this back to back, is to pick out these differences that you wouldn't spot normally. Let's go again.
Yeah, and the dryness is interesting. There's a touch of tannin on this wine, and I think it's something you can probably pick up on the rosé as well. And I think I really like that, because that touch of tannin, it's not like it's tannic, but that dryness, sort of the tea leaf character to it, makes it really sort of moorish and complex. And again, fantastic with food to have that little bit of grip and interest. But yeah, lovely sort of full finish. It feels serious to me. Is how you sort of approach that one. It's not as flamboyant or easygoing as some of perhaps the Brut Reserve is. I think,
following on from what you're saying, what I like about it is that it's fuller. You know, there's it's just weightier. You know, it's like the tongue has a bit more to grapple onto. Which again is probably why I say it is pairing better with other food groups. But amazingly, hearing you speak about it and then digesting what's going on in my mouth is it feels like there's loads going on there. That's what I'm finding really, really interesting, is the mouthfeel, the complexity, it's like it's dancing on my tongue. It's a wonderful sensation. But yeah, again, love to try it with food again.
Yeah, there's a richness to it, which I think goes really well with, and cheese perhaps, but also, you know, pork and these sort of things that could go very well with, and that's the touch of tannin there too. But there's also, it's starting to develop and open up now, and there's almost a touch of meatiness or something in the back there on the finish that's really sort of a tertiary element, which again, it adds to that really sort of serious quality to the wine. So it's not just a fun wine to drink in the sun. It's a wine you sit and think about, I think, and consider.
Absolutely, and you want to have wines that do that there's a lot more going on, because, as we're saying, it compared different food groups, there's a bit more aging, and it's just nice to have that mouthfeel. It's nice to have the added complexities. So yeah, absolutely.
And again, it's not, you wouldn't taste this and think, wow, it's just really, you know, cool climates. It's quite it could stand up there some you know, fuller, rounder wines from around the world, I think.
Definitely. It's as you say, I don't think initially, if you were tasting these blinds, you'd immediately think, as you say, a cool climate. It's too crisp, it's too fresh. Not at all. It's very balanced aromas. Oh, I got an amazing zing of grapefruit then on the end. I didn't get last time. Wow. Blood grapefruit as well. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good show.
Unexpected, but lovely.
And I think there'll be more and more, you know, Blanc de Noirs is not a particularly, it's not a style you find a lot, but anywhere, actually, not just in England and elsewhere. It's a lesser produced style. But I think when done well, and you have the added ripeness, it's really, really interesting. I mean, I'm a Chardonnay fan. I'm all about Chardonnay, and that's kind of where I sit generally on these wines. But if you can do this well, it works really well. And as you say, the blood orange, and there's almost the sort of orange zest character to it as well. It's lots of complexity, lots of interest there. It's quite a rewarding one.
I like the way it's also different to the previous wines. You know, and as you say, it's good to have wines that aren't too similar, particularly within your range. You know, your portfolio, you want to have distinction. That's what I was looking for between the wines, and that's what this wine says to me immediately. Is I'm different. This is where I stand, and I think it'd be really interesting to see where it's going to go as well. There's a fuller elements to it. So sorry, Carol.
No, I was going to say, I mean, that's really important in terms of our blending and what we try to do to making the wines, that there is this point of difference. Because, you know, back in the very early days, I remember we had a Brut Reserve that was kind of dominant Chardonnay, and then a Blanc 100% Chardonnay, and then a Rosé that had a lot of Chardonnay in. And there wasn't, in my mind, especially between the Brut and the Blanc, enough differentiation to say, okay, each of these wines needs to have a persona, a character. It needs to have a style, and there needs to be an aim and direction behind it. It's not just, oh, that's what that wine year gave us. There needs to be much more thought in terms of the constructs behind that. So that's great that you're, you know, brilliant that you're saying that you can recognise each one of these wines has a specific character and personality, because we work hard at that, I think, in trying to define what they are. Great.
Well, yeah, it shows. Absolutely. Do you want to move on to the next one?
Next wine, yeah, lovely. So, final wine, 2016 Rosé. And Rosé for us, I think, is an interesting one, but hard to define in some ways. You know, because in some ways it's the pink one, you know, and it's kind of it could be its persona in that. But I think we try to think beyond. We try to find a nice balance between fruit and complexity, because ultimately, I think, for me, when we're talking about, especially the Brut, the Blanc de Blanc and the Blanc de Noir, fruit's not actually the first thing we talk about. Actually, nowadays, we're much more interested in texture, complexity, minerality, those things, because we kind of know the fruit's there. But I think when you're talking about sparkling rosé, fruit has got to be at the core. You know, you do have to have a wine that is fruity and is enjoyable and is. It doesn't have to be less complex, but it just needs to be fruit-driven, in my mind. So we work hard at doing that, of trying to get those red berries. And of all the wines we've got, you do start to get that, you know, wild strawberry, raspberry, cherry characters in there, which we work hard to develop. But equally, we don't want this wine to be a tutti frutti Blossom Hill style rosé, you know. So we want it to have some seriousness about that. So we do work hard at actually sort of adding those tertiary elements in there too. And again, as with the last one, a touch of grip is actually a really good way of making it more serious, but also more food friendly at the same time. And in terms of our philosophy of making rosé, obviously the difference between making rosé and the other ones is how to get the colour in there. And there's obviously two methods of doing that. You have the saignée, or the skin contact way of making the wine, and then you have the assemblage, or where you're adding red wine to the blend to give it that colour. Both of them have, you know, pros and cons. I think the saignée, or the skin contact method, it really does give you that weight in the fruit that you're looking for. It doesn't always have some of the longevity if you use all of your wine to do that stage. It doesn't necessarily age for a long time. Equally, the adding red wine is perfect at getting the right colour and retaining that elegance and consistency in the wine. They can be a bit austere, is the counter to that. So we like to use both, both the best of both worlds. So you know, a lot of the wine will actually just be normal standard base wine as we're using the rest of them. So that elegance and poise. A certain amount will be kept on skins, so we can get that lovely red fruit character in there, and the cherries and strawberries. And then we add a ton amount of red wine to really just fine tune the colour. And at the very end, but we'll add a very small amount of red wine. It might be 4 or 5%. The reason we do that, we make a red wine, which we're very proud of, in small quantities, and it's quite heavily coloured. It's quite, you know, a full wine. So you only actually have to add about 4 or 5% to it. And what that means is you can get the impact of the colour without actually it tasting vinous or winey. So that's kind of what we try to achieve. We give it less time, again, to promote the fruit. It's generally released a bit earlier. This is probably the back end of this vintage. And we would have less time on lees, so you promote the fruit. And we'd also generally have a little bit more sugar to try and just, you know, elevate that fruit profile.
Okay. What immediately jumped out to me was the red fruits, which obviously you expect for roses, but more particularly that it's you know, if you get like if you have a raspberry or a strawberry and it's slightly warm, there's a bit more sweetness, a bit more texture. That's what I got. It's like warm raspberries, warm strawberries, rather than, you know, fresh fruit salad, fruit bowl, which was a real distinction, because normally it's not the case. So it's that softness whilst having the lovely berry textures. So let me just go through again.
And it's got this lovely, it's got the lovely baked things to back that up, and maybe that supports your thing about the warm raspberries. It's almost like a raspberry coulis and a strawberry tart. There's something there that just gives you that character.
Yeah, no, lovely. Again, a really nice mouthfeel. Quite nice drying elements on the tongue. But yeah, it is the fruit element. It is, and that's what you want from a rosé, whether it's a still or a sparkling. You want a burst of intensity of red fruits, which is the purpose. Again, I'd love to try it with some food. I feel like I want to have pate on toast with it. That's the first thing that jumped out.
Yeah.
So I think it would cut through the fattiness of that beautifully. And some of the pastry elements that you've mentioned. Really nice finish, so it's still there. But it's, again, balance. And that's something I've picked up with a lot of your wines, is the balance, is the texture, the dimension. And this is expressing and showing that beautifully. Yeah, and there's a softness to it, which is important, because we've spoken a lot about acidity, we've spoken a lot about being in a cool climate, a lot of what that can bring to the wines. But again, a word we've used a lot is the balance, and that's what this wine is showing well, and that's what I mean by the softness. You know, everything's in line with itself, nothing is out of kink, which I imagine isn't too easy to achieve. Again, going back to the climate, and particularly with the rosé, because whether you're doing the blending of a little bit of the white wine or not, the red wine. But yes, very well achieved balance. It's the main thing I'm picking up on.
I think the balance and the weight is something we work, you know, that's one of our key objectives really, I think, as well. Because in England, you have, what we call the donut. So you have a wine that has this amazing, because of the acidity, it's got this attack, and you're like, oh, what wakes you up? And then it has this great length towards the end. And the length's not just about acidity, it's flavour too, but the two are intertwined and they do carry each other backwards. Sometimes you find the middle, there's a hole in the middle, and you get this slightly thin, slightly watery or greener edge to it. And I think that lets some wines down. So we work very hard at just trying to make sure that from front to back, you get this full, intense mouthful, and it's mouth-watering, but also it's creamy and it's round. So we work a lot on that, and there's a few techniques you can use. And oak's very, very useful, especially the older oak. That really sits in that mid palate and that weight, and gives that softness as well. So that's a key objective, I think, of just trying to make sure that we're not too lean. We're vibrant and exciting, but we're not too acidic.
And you don't want any part of it lacking, as you're saying. It's the transition between the initial burst of the fruit to the mid-palate to a lasting finish. You need that to be in line with one another. So, as I say, it's a smooth transition, and that's what's been achieved, and that is lining up with what you're saying, all these extra elements that you are adding. So, yeah, lovely sparkling wine in a nutshell. Charlie, it's been a pleasure tasting with you. Superb wines as always. Is there anything else you'd like to mention about Gusbourne or yourself?
No, the only thing I'd like to say is that obviously when this all opens up and we're out of sort of our lockdown, we'd love to see people here. The big thing for me is, and the same with all the English wine producers as well, is that we have these amazing things on our doorsteps too, that you can come to the countryside. We're half an hour outside of London. You can be in beautiful fresh air and come and see us. And once you do that, I think you get a full, real understanding of who we are and what we do. So, hopefully when we're all allowed to, you're all very much welcome to come down and pay us a visit. But that was my only thing really, just because I want to see people and meet people again. They'll starve the contact, but no, nothing else to add really. Thank you very much for having me on and tasting the wines with me.
That's a pleasure, Charlie. Thank you very much.